Welcome. It's our privilege as part of the 50th anniversary celebration of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon to have as our very special guest in Cridersville. We've put him through 2 parades in the last 2 days as well too, and he's been a real trooper for that. Dr. Glenn Smith. He is our connection to NASA and the Apollo missions and other missions that NASA has undertaken over the years of his service there. So we're very proud. We can say with confidence that if you need a rocket scientist, Glenn Smith is your guy, and he's from the Cridersville class of 1952. So hear, hear. Glenn Smith was born in July of 1934, the son of Warren and Marcel Smith. They moved to Cridersville when Glenn was only 2, so we consider him a lifer for Cridersville as far as his schooling age. His maternal grandparents were Frank and Lelia Phillips of Cridersville. Glenn attended all 12 years of his elementary and secondary education at Cridersville School on East Main Street. We've got a picture of what it looked like without the gymnasium attached. I think Glenn's basketball career was still in the old community hall, right, down the street, or down the alley from the school. After graduating from Cridersville High School in 1952, Glenn attended Bowling Green State University, and in 1952 and 53, then transferred to the Ohio Northern University at Ada, Ohio. He graduated in 1956 with high distinction and was first in his class in the College of Engineering. And we know the prestige of ONU for engineering. That's another major accomplishment. While at Ohio Northern, Smith was an outstanding athlete in both basketball and baseball. He was inducted into the ONU Athletic Hall of Fame. In 1963, he earned a Master's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering at the University of Pittsburgh. He completed his PhD in 1965, becoming Dr. Glenn Smith. His doctoral thesis, now you youngsters here, this is what you're going to be working on. His doctoral thesis topic was the heat transfer in nuclear reactors, which was pretty cutting edge, I would suspect, at that time. From 1956 until 67, Smith also worked at Westinghouse Electric as a design engineer, designing electric power generators for aircraft and the space program. In addition, he worked part-time at the Atomic Power Labs in Pittsburgh. In 1967, he joined the staff at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston, and as we say, the rest was history. So I would like to introduce, for his comments and presentation tonight, Dr. Glenn Smith, native of Cridersville, Ohio.
Thank you, Greg, for that extremely generous introduction.
And deserve it.
It's great to be here among friends, family, and everybody, and many, many friends from the old days of Cridersville. I feel a little bit nervous about coming here and talking to all you good people. So I was just about speechless. So I asked Sue, my wife, Sue, stand up, will you? And then our 4 children are here. Where are they at? I'd like them to stand up. There's Marty, Robin, Lori, and Gretchen. They came from Houston, Oklahoma City, and New York. Anyhow, I asked Sue, what should I say? And she said, well, don't try to sound intellectual or witty or generous. Just be yourself. So I'm going to tell you, they always told us in NASA when we talk to groups, just tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. The last part is going to be a question and answer, so I'm going to go for about a short time telling you some things that most people have seen these documentaries, some things that you don't hear on the documentaries. So now we go. First I'll tell you how I came to NASA. I was working for Westinghouse in Lima, and I saw an ad Must have been in a magazine or something. And they were looking for, this was about 1966, they were looking for scientist engineers. And they had minimum requirements. And I thought, well, I met the minimum requirements, doctor's degree, and I was a pilot and an athlete. I thought there's nobody any better suited for that job as an astronaut than me. So I applied. After a while, they sent back a letter and says, well, you didn't make it, came close, but try again next time. Oh man, what a defeat. So, through the dean of our engineering college at the University of Pittsburgh, I got an interview because he had a personal friend who was head of engineering at the Johnson Space Center. So through him, I got an interview with Dr. Max Faget, head of the inventor of the capsule to return Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. So the day before I was about ready to leave, to fly down for that interview, his assistant, named Tony Yader, calls me and he says, Glenn, I'm sorry to tell you this, but NASA headquarters has put a freeze on us. We're not allowed to hire anybody. I said, what? Well, after a few seconds, I says, well, will you talk to me if I come anyway? Yes. Okay, but it won't do any good. So I flew down the next day, had an interview with Dr. Faget, and while I was there, Faget was working, it was just after the Apollo fire, which killed 3 of our astronauts in Cape Kennedy. So he said, you got any ideas on why that fire started? And I said, no, but I'd be glad to work on it. So while I was there, I got interviews with the head of science and the head of programs, which ran all the money for Apollo. And by golly, turned out I got 3 job offers. So with a lot of luck and little persistence, it changed my life. So at this point, I have a little something for Greg Myers, who's done so much for Cridersville and Wapakoneta, and I'd like to present where are you, Greg? Here you are, man. This is something from your friends at NASA.
Oh my gosh. I think I know what that is. It's more than one thing.
Yeah, 2 things in there.
Oh my gosh. Genuine NASA coffee mug. And I think I have a very large head, so let me.
Yeah.
That was that bad.
You got to put it on, man.
My own NASA.
So I'm going to make a couple of short remarks, and then open it up for questions, and I hope I have answers for you. In listening to Dr. James Hansen's presentation wrote the biography of Neil, he went through all his thing in a historical procedure, and there were hardly any questions. And I don't know why, but anyhow, I hope each one of you, as I go through some things here, will keep in mind what kind of questions you'd like to ask in the question and answer period. So we'll try to answer all those. We moved to Houston in 1967, and at that time there were about 5,000 civil service employees and about 10,000 contractors in the immediate area within 10-15 miles, so quite a community. We lived in a place called Nassau Bay, right across the street from the Johnson Space Center. And across the back fence, about two houses down, lived Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz had a medium-sized dog, maybe a little bit larger than medium, and he bought a saddle for that dog. And he had a monkey that would put in that saddle and they'd run around the neighborhood. You don't see that every day. He was always different. Let's see. Let's do the next slide. This is the Apollo Applications Program, which I worked on, became Skylab. So it used a lot of Apollo equipment, mostly all Apollo equipment, but it was our nation's first space station. And astronauts stayed there for increasing periods of time to see its effect on the human body and learn a lot of things about that. Next slide. One thing I got to do that a lot of people don't get to do is the fighter jets lined down are T-38s. They're the Maseratis of planes, and the astronauts use those to fly around and keep proficiency, they say, but anyhow, they liked it a lot. Up there is the KC-135, which is the military version of the Boeing 707. Now, they took out all the seats and all the cargo stuff, put padding on the inside of it. Next slide. And they would fly parabolas like this, and they'd go down, pull about twice the force of gravity, and then come up over the top, and they'd float for about 25 seconds. So the astronauts used that for training. So I asked them, can I take a ride on that? And they said, yeah, okay. So I took a ride on that. One thing, they don't call it the Vomit Comet for nothing. Oh boy. The next slide, Greg. This is the International Space Station, and I hear one of the special astronauts that was commander on the International Space Station and was commander for like 6 months. And a couple of Russians and a couple of Americans reported to her. Her name is Suni Williams. And is she going to be here?
Yes, she will be here.
She will be here. So anyhow, she's a fantastic person. And then next slide. That is the actual Apollo 11 launch. That Saturn launch vehicle is something fantastic. The whole thing was 363 feet tall, really big, and it was powered by 5 engines on the bottom. Each one of them produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust and gobbled up 3 tons of fuel per second. Yeah. Next slide. Now this is the very top. This is the escape rocket. This is the command module that carried the 3 astronauts on the way to the moon. This is the service module, and the lunar module was contained in this covering down here. And remember, the whole thing up to the tip was 363 feet tall. Next slide. There's Neil in a recent photo. If he looked like he was getting a little pudgy, it's true. Next slide. Now this is a very poor picture of Neil making his first step on the moon. This camera was a black and white camera, was located on one of the legs of the lunar module. Next slide. This is a picture of the lunar module, and that's Buzz Aldrin in his spacesuit. They were both trained to take each other's pictures on the moon, but when they got back, there weren't any pictures of Neil on the moon. But a lot of pictures of Buzz Aldrin. Now, the third man forgotten is Mike Collins. Mike Collins stayed in the command module circling the moon, and he was their trip home. So they went to the moon, come off the moon, joined up with Mike Collins in the command module, command and service module we called it, and went home. Now Mike wrote a great book called Carrying the Fire. And Mike, in that, he had a short description of several of the astronauts, and I've reproduced 3 of them for you. So John Glenn, the only one I don't really know, as he was leaving, as I was entering, one thing for sure though, he's the best PR man in the bunch. Neil Armstrong makes decisions slowly and well. As Borman, that's Frank Borman, he was commander of a couple of missions, and a great commander. Armstrong savors them, rolling them around on his tongue like a fine wine and swallowing at the very last moment. He had 20 seconds of fuel remaining when he landed on the moon. You probably got that from the documentaries. Neil was a classy guy, we all agree to that, and I can't offhand think of a better choice to be the first man on the moon. Mike Collins. Buzz Aldrin, heavy man, heavy. Would make a champion chess player, always thinks several moves ahead. If you don't understand what Buzz is talking about today, you will tomorrow or the next day. Fame is not worn well with Buzz. I think he resents being not first on the moon, but more than he appreciates being the second. My main job at NASA was working on the space shuttle. This is the launch of the space shuttle. This is something that I wrote about the space shuttle. This is the face of NASA to most of the world for 30 years. 20 or 50 or 100 years from today, the shuttle will be remembered as an extremely useful vehicle and a technical marvel. Nothing can compare with its functional ability serving as a launch vehicle, cargo carrier, both up and down, human transporter, on-orbit living quarters, construction shack, space station builder, satellite launcher and retriever, satellite servicer, and research lab in itself. Now the head of exhibits at the Space Center Houston Museum next door to the Johnson Space Center, he liked that, so he put that in as part of the shuttle exhibit there. It was mostly reusable, entering the atmosphere like a spaceship and transitioning to operation as an airplane and landing on a runway with the crew walking away with dignity and relative comfort, with the entire final approach and landing viewable on live TV by millions around the world, reminding U.S. citizens of America's technical and geopolitical leadership. And he liked it, and he put it as part of the shuttle exhibit. Now this is the exhibit they have at the museum next to the Johnson Space Center. That's this Boeing 747, and the shuttle is a mock-up. It's not the real, one of the real shuttles, but it's set up to where you can go inside both vehicles. They have platforms. You can go inside and see how big it is and how it looks like. Actually, the shuttle, the payload bay on the shuttle is 60 feet long and 15 feet in diameter and can put 65,000 pounds into Earth orbit. To give you an idea of the size of that, they could launch a fully loaded Greyhound bus into orbit if they wanted to. It fit the payload bay and the weight limit to everything. Now if you have questions.
The gentleman asked if that plane was the American. The American? Was that the shuttle, the American?
Oh, yes.
Yes?
Oh, yes. It was American.
Okay.
And if he stands beside me, I don't hear very well. Maybe Greg can repeat any questions you have, and I can hear him better than I can hear anybody else.
Are there other questions of Dr. Smith? Yes, Mike, you had your hand up first.
Dr. Smith, you mentioned you worked, your main job was the space shuttle. So could you maybe define that a little bit more for us as far as your overall role for space shuttle? And then
I didn't get all that.
That is, there probably were some good feelings and maybe at times some not so good feelings related to the shuttle. Could you maybe talk about those for your career?
He wanted to know what your role was with the shuttle program, and then what might have been the good times and the bad times during shuttle.
Okay. Well, of course, the bad times first. There were 2 shuttle accidents. One that blew up, and we lost 7 astronauts. It was about 1986. And then they had that was the Challenger. And then we had the Columbia accident in the early 90s. Those were the bad parts. The good parts, and what I did, was my program manager that hired me into NASA he was in charge of the total shuttle budget. At the peak, he was spending $5 million a day on the shuttle with contractors and everybody. So I was a technical advisor to Bob Thompson, who was in charge of all and you could say like a troubleshooter. We had problems in development, and we'd do tests, and we'd find failures that showed up in testing, and there were quite a few of those. So we'd find out what went wrong, what it took to fix it, and there were always safety implications, cost, and schedule with whatever change we decided to make. So that's what I did.
Thank you.
Ma'am, you had a question?
Did Mike Collins ever get to go on another mission where he got to walk on the moon?
Did Mike Collins ever get another mission where he got to walk on the moon?
Mike Collins never walked on the moon. He stayed in the command module, and he wrote a really nice book called Carrying the Fire, and I referred to that earlier. But Mike became executive director of the Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian in Washington. So he had a pretty good job, and very responsible job.
Glenn, did he ever go in space again after Apollo 11?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I don't believe so.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Tell us about getting your pilot's license. Did that happen here in Lima or Lima?
I think he wants to know where you got your pilot's license.
Shortly after I graduated from Ohio Northern, I always built model airplane. I was interested in flying. So north of Ada, there's a little grass field airport. That's where I learned to fly, in Aranca Champ. And I think they have an Aranca Champ in the Armstrong Museum here in Wapak. Same airplane. And it's great visibility. We loved it.
He said he's flown in and out of the Ada airport too.
Oh yeah. It only had a 65 horsepower engine, right? And wouldn't go very fast, but it was basic.
But that runway had a hill on it, if you remember.
A little bit.
A little bit of a hill. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
Did you have many experiences with Neil Armstrong?
Did you have many experiences with Neil Armstrong?
Many. Neil was extremely busy training for the lunar mission. And I can remember visiting with him in about December of 1968, maybe 7 months before his lunar mission. I said, Neil, you got Buzz Aldrin and Mike Collins as a crew. Neil was the commander. Buzz was the lunar module pilot, and Mike Collins was the command module pilot. And he says, yeah, could be. That was it. He wasn't one to brag. He's very humble guy. You probably got that from the documentaries and all the information about Neil.
Another question. Yes, sir.
Sir, does the name Brandewee ring any bells for you?
Does the name Brandewee ring any bells for you? Brandewee?
I don't think so.
he was a Purdue graduate from Minster, and he was selected to be an astronaut, and he was killed in an aircraft accident on takeoff from New York before he ever got that far. He was one of the first 7 or 8 I understand.
Was it just a commercial aircraft crash? Was it a commercial aircraft crash or a military?
It was a pilot. He was a pilot. A Purdue graduate, was a pilot, was one of the first 7 or 8 selected in the astronaut program, I understand.
He was from Minster and was selected early on as an astronaut, but was unfortunately killed in a Air Force crash, right? A flight crash?
Yes.
Yep.
That fellow is Raleigh Bernhold, folks. He was a star guard for Minster, in Cridersville, where Minster were just like this in basketball. He was so good.
Other questions?
Glenn, I don't think you told how you first met Neil at the airport, and also you didn't tell about the emails.
I didn't tell him how I met Neil.
I don't think so. I think
Didn't I say I flew a small plane into this airport?
that was the news, I think you told me.
Okay, I'm sorry. Covered that earlier. But anyhow, I took a job at the Johnson Space Center, which at that time was the Manned Spacecraft Center. They changed it because of politics, named it after a politician. None of us liked it very much, but that's the way it is. Anyhow, so I wanted to come to Houston to scout out a place to move my family down there. So I flew my small plane from Ada to Houston, landed at this small airport not far away from the Johnson Space Center, and went in to the reception place, and there was one other pilot there, and we got to chatting, and what's your name? He says, Neil Armstrong. Oh, he was there flying just for fun of his own private plane. Okay, where are you from, Neil? Wapakoneta. Oh, wow. I'm from there too. So we found out we had a lot in common. He had part-time jobs all through high school and college. I did too. He played a baritone in the high school and Purdue bands. I did too. Was in the Boy Scouts, although he went a lot further than I did. So we just had a lot in common. So that was in 1967, the summer of '67, and we'd been friends ever since. Now, I tell you the story of the last time I interacted with Neil. It was August of 2012, and I heard on the news that Neil had had a heart attack and was in the hospital. So I sent him an email, and I can repeat it exactly. Neil, before I tell you what was in there, when Neil was training as an astronaut, he came in 1962, from 62 to 69. He was an anomaly in the astronaut crew. All of them were test pilots, and they were just jocks. They just trained hard. Neil says, I've only got so many beats in this heart, and I'm not going to waste them exercising. So I sent him a note, and I said, Neil, sorry you're in there. Get well quick. If you're going stir crazy, you know, it's very boring in the hospital. From his laptop on his husband's bed, he said, thanks, Glenn. It was quite a surprise, but it's going to be okay. Maybe I should get some exercise. And he died the next day. Oh, yeah. But
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Did you ever have any interactions with LBJ or Richard Nixon?
Did you ever have any interactions with Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon?
oh, no. But just after the first lunar landing, Nixon came to the Johnson Space Center and gave a speech, and we were in the crowd, and he was, taking credit for all of that stuff. And there were protesters carrying signs. And a couple of the signs says, "Moon rocks do not feed my children." And a couple of engineers who worked at NASA turned to one another and says, "They feed mine."
Lynn, I was reading that you did testify before Congress a couple of times.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, not much of it, but it was. I was working with Neil and a couple other gentlemen with emails back and forth, trying to make political influence to keep the shuttle flying until we had a replacement. Well, as it turned out, that we were unsuccessful, and there was a period, how long? A long time, when the shuttle went down and we had to rely on the Russians to get U.S. astronauts to space. What a shame. What a political, stupid mistake, but that's history.
Yes, ma'am.
Did Westinghouse Lima have anything on the shuttle?
Did Westinghouse and Lima have any parts on the shuttle?
Westinghouse built an electric power conditioning unit that generated electricity from the batteries. And they did that on Apollo, and I was part of working to get, there's Dan Arnett, he probably remembers that. He worked at Westinghouse at the time. We needed the same sort of job done on Apollo applications, which was the Skylab. So I put people in contact with each other, and then Westinghouse built the power converter for, Dan, you hold your hand up. People might want to talk about that.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Being a graduate of Cridersville,
Another graduate.
how do you feel Cridersville prepared you to become a scientist?
Russ Hawley's also a graduate of Cridersville. He wants to know how you feel Cridersville School prepared you to be a scientist.
There is something about small town America, like Cridersville, that makes a person out of you. It's the ethics, the relationships they build. If you did anything wrong, everybody in town knew it. So nobody did anything wrong. We'd park our car in front of the house, leave the keys in it. No problem.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What are your thoughts on the future of the space program and Space Force?
And the Space Force.
Yeah, the future of the space program and Space Force.
Okay, the future of the space program is being planned right now, and the Vice President is the head of a study group to answer that question. And of course, and they haven't come out with their answers yet, but they've given some preliminary answers. We want to send people back to the moon to stay, and do it by 2024. So they got 5 years to do it. But the head of NASA says it's going to take $5 billion a year more than what we're getting now. So there's a problem. The OMB, Office of Management and Budget, is trying to hold all those costs down. I'm going to spend it on other things. This is very interesting. I used to give talks to people. They'd send me out to talk to groups, mainly engineering groups. But I would ask them, does anybody know what percentage of the federal budget is devoted to NASA? That's cheating.
0.49.
That's exactly correct. Less than a half of 1% comes to NASA. So anyhow, they do a lot for that bit of the federal budget.
John, did you have a question?
Glenn, would you like to go to Mars?
No. No, let me talk about that. Excuse me, my nose runs because I got a CPAP machine. Mars is desolate. The atmosphere is 1/100th of the Earth's atmosphere. It's bombarded with radiation and very dry. There are dust storms which cover things all the time. And of course the main question is, why? I wouldn't want to do it. And there's a lot of radiation someone would get on the way to Mars, on the Mars surface, and then getting back. And that'd be a real challenge to develop systems that are that reliable for that length of time. It just...
Yes, sir.
That kind of leads into the next question. Were you ever in on the discussion of why go to the moon, or why continue exploring the moon, or not continue there at the end of the Apollos?
Asking if you were ever involved in discussions about why go to the moon or why go back to the moon?
When President Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon, that was it.
Yeah.
We never questioned that. Some other people did, but we never questioned that. And everybody worked as a team. What can I do? I'm determined not to be the cause of any goof or problem in making this a success. So it was a team effort that you don't see a lot today.
That's for sure. Yes, sir.
Dr. Smith, you're an engineer. The problem we have here, that costs $1,000 to $5,000 to get a pound of stuff into orbit. Is there anything in the pipeline to reduce that cost?
Is there anything in the pipeline to reduce the cost of getting something into orbit, that it's so expensive to get it off the Earth and into orbit?
Yes. Yes. NASA is building something called the Space Launch System, which is about roughly the size of the Saturn and the Shuttle Launch System, and will cost a lot, maybe up to $60 billion over its lifetime. And NASA would need a lot more money to do that. However, a very powerful senator from Louisiana has put that into law. NASA is required to do that. But at the same time, there are commercial companies that say, without NASA giving us daily direction, we could do it for 1/3 the cost. And it's called SpaceX and a couple of others. And that makes the most sense. But it's a wound up in politics.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts on the private companies that are going into space now? Is that a good thing, or?
Is it a good thing or not a good thing for the private companies to go into space?
It's a good thing. What's in the pipeline are private companies going to take people into orbit for money. It won't be cheap, but you know, it's a lot cheaper than what NASA has spent in the past, and it's really a good thing, in my opinion. And so the management at NASA in Washington has to deal with all that politics stuff. They're in a tight spot because everybody knows we can buy things cheaper and better from commercial companies than we can from this outfit that uses traditional companies like Boeing and Lockheed, and they're at 3 times the cost of the private companies. So who knows how that's going to turn out?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe the environment working at NASA? Was it highly stressful before all these missions, and then after you were successful with a huge silent relief?
He wants to know what it was like working at NASA. Was it highly stressful and very fast-paced, and then was it a relief when you retired?
It was. It wasn't stressful for me because I was making contributions to the success of everything NASA was trying to do, and I felt good about that. And when you do that in life, you feel good about yourself.
How did you feel when you retired?
Oh, when I retired, I missed it somewhat. Yeah, but I kept contact with my old friends also in NASA at the time and retirees. So they made it good for retirees. So they're very security census. They gave us retirees badges so we can go on site and just like the regular folks.
Any other question? One question over here.
How did they determine which astronaut was going to be the first to walk on the moon?
How did they determine who was to be the first to walk on the moon?
Very good question. A man named Chris Kraft, who organized the first control center. In fact, they named today's control center after Christopher C. Columbus Kraft, Jr. When they first started training to go on the moon, Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong, it was traditional for the lunar module pilot to step out of the spacecraft first. That's how it worked in a Gemini program. So the early training, Buzz was planning to step out on the moon first. And Chris saw that one day and he says, wow. He wrote this in his book, so it was also picked up by Dr. James Hansen. He said, we can't let this happen. So Chris called a meeting between the 3 top decision makers in the Apollo program and said, look, Neil, the man that first steps on the moon is going to be like Charles Lindbergh. He will be the most famous man in the world for decades, if not centuries. We got to change it. And all 3 of the guys agreed with him, and they said, okay, it is changed. So that's how Neil became the first man to step on the moon instead of Buzz Aldrin.
Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, Glenn, we truly appreciate it.
You got another one?
I don't know if anybody here attended on Sunday afternoon, but WBGU has done a absolutely wonderful 30-minute documentary about Mr. Armstrong growing up in Ohio and learning to fly at Port Conetta. It's very touching. It should air probably sometime next week, and then they'll be repeating it. And it will go out.
9 o'clock.
Pardon me?
25th at 9 o'clock.
25th at 9 o'clock, thank you. And then it will be released to public stations across the country, PBS stations across the country to also show. It's a perfect 30-minute time frame to be shown in classrooms too. And it speaks very much to what you're talking about, Glenn, the small community and that nurturing environment that creates the right kind of person, like Neil Armstrong. So we like to tell students in Wapakoneta and Cridersville that there are very few people in the history of the world that will be remembered and honored forever, and Mr. Armstrong is likely to be one of them. 500 years from now, as you said, Glenn.
Amen.
He will be remembered. And you will in Cridersville.
Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. All right, we have refreshments in the back. I'm sure. Oh.
you have anything to say to Dr. Glenn this evening?
Oh, we do. We do. I mentioned earlier, thank you for reminding me, she who must be obeyed in the back of the room. I mentioned that Dr. Smith was born in July of 1934, but it was actually on July 15th, 1934. So would everyone join us in a round of happy birthday, Dr.
What's
Smith?
today?
Happy birthday.
Oh my goodness.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday,
That's a bit much.
happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
And our refreshments do include birthday cake, so please help yourself. There's plenty of time to talk with one another. There's information at the end of the table about membership in the Cridersville Historical Society, our upcoming membership events, the things that we do, programs like this. And there's also a calendar, because this is kind of part of the overall 50th anniversary celebration. There's also an events page for what's left to happen throughout this week in the community celebrating Mr. Armstrong's accomplishment. Thank you so very much for coming, everyone.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. I won't take this off. Wear this all weekend, maybe.